In the first quarter of 1971, true to the program plan and guidelines that we developed in the fourth quarter of 1970, step number one was to figure out what the code should be. And we formed a code committee. I forget the exact name, but it was a code committee. And we were lucky enough to pick one of the guys who joined the ad hoc committee as a technical assistant to Art Larkin, who represented General Foods. The committee ended up picking Bob Stringer, who was head of distribution for General Foods and a marvelous person who had been in the industry for God knows how many years, and he headed up that committee. And then later on, slightly later on, we also created a symbol committee, and the chairman of that committee was Alan Haberman, who was then CEO of First National Stores in Boston. I'll come back to that in a minute. They proved to be also a phenomenal group of people that ultimately were key, as I said very early, to the success of the entire project. Next thing that happened in the first quarter was we heard from two organizations who had basically ideas and patents for this whole process. Sheragon, a little company in Boston, and another company called Resource for Lawyers. They didn't have the wherewithal to build a system, and so they viewed this as an opportunity to exploit or to say benefit from the patents that they held. This was very important because it triggered us to be quite concerned about the legal implications of proceeding without the cover, if you will, of the ANSI standardization process. I'll come back to that. Now, another thing that happened right about this time after Sheragon showed up, remember I told you earlier about John Clark from Booz Allen. Well, I didn't go with Booz Allen, I went with McKinsey. But John Clark didn't stay with Booz Allen. He was recruited by the then Postmaster General of the United States, and he worked his way up to be one of the top guys in the Nixon administration. He was actually the #2 personnel director for the Nixon administration. And I called up John and I said, John, I think we might have a problem here with a possible activity that some people might consider to be an antitrust violation. He said, well, come on down. And I went down, I visited him in his office in what was the State Department, used to be the State Department building right next to the White House. He had a magnificent office. He was obviously well connected and able to help. And I explained the situation. He said, not a problem. Picked up the phone and he called the head of the FTC. And he said to this gentleman, look, the Nixon administration has given careful consideration to this project, and we are in total support of it. And I hope that you will arrange to have the rest of your colleagues meet with Mr. Russell. I'm sending him over promptly. Thank you very much. All the best. Goodbye. Now, later on, we got a lot more sophisticated. And Steve Brown and others and lawyers and so forth actually made a formal introduction. And I think in Steve's terrific book, if I'm not mistaken, there's a chapter or two that deals with all of the efforts that we made to stay within the law, keep the FTC and the Justice Department appraised and so forth. But anyway, I'll claim the first contact. Now, the Code Committee under Bob had to wrestle with a lot of fascinating things you might not have thought about. If you have a code on an item, let's go back to the Campbell's tomato soup. So you got a code for the soup, and it's a social security number for that can of soup. But that soup is packed out in 12s and 24s. In other words, there's different case codes for the same item. And the Code Committee had to figure out how in the world you're going to deal with a code numbering system that would in effect accommodate automated reorder as well as scanning, and deal with the fact that you have to differentiate the case code from the item code. The second thing that we had to do, again, we're only in the first quarter of 1971, is we had to figure out if a single code numbering system were adopted, whether it's 7 digits or 11 digits or 50 digits, and it was going to identify every item sold, and there was no structure to the code, then somebody had to administer the code. So we then solicited proposals and ideas from Dun & Bradstreet, from S&P, and from a little company called Distribution Number Bank that was a subsidiary of a trade organization, I think it was NAGA. And the numbers and suggestions that came in were daunting. I mean, these big organizations chose not to do any creative thinking. They simply came in and said, well, it's going to cost you millions and millions a year to administer this code numbering system, no matter what it is. And so we were a little discouraged at that point. But we said, well, look, why don't we start down the trail of figuring out what codes the grocery manufacturers use today. A code used by a retailer was not terribly useful because it didn't cut across all the other retails, but a code used by a manufacturer was useful. And we did a survey, thanks again to George Cook, who was then head of GMA, and Steve Brown, who was the counsel there too. We were able to survey most of the manufacturers in the United States, grocery manufacturers, and we found, to our amazement, that 95-point-something% of all the case codes were 5 digits and less, and they were all numeric. Aha! Now, there was a later session, it was a brainstorming session, and I honestly forget who was there. I was there, but there was probably others. And we came after a long trip to California when you could get something to eat and drink on the airplane. We came up with the idea, well, let's suppose we have a code number that designates a manufacturer, and we let the code manufacturer designate each item. And then we say to the manufacturer, all right, now there's a 10-digit code. You be in charge of administering your own code numbers, and you be in charge of telling the distribution industry what the code number is for the Campbell tomato soup and what the corresponding case code number was. Now that proved to be fascinating, but we had to take one more step. We had to make sure that 5 digits, for example, was sufficient for all the items that a company might have or might choose to have over the ensuing decades. And that required an enormous amount of communication with an enormous number of manufacturers, and I had the privilege of doing a lot of those interviews, and we concluded that by and large it was going to work. And then we had to figure out how many manufacturers there'd be. And we figured at the time, remember, we're only worried about the grocery industry, and 5 digits gives you 99,999, which was far in excess of the number of manufacturers in the United States. So we said, this looks pretty good. It looks pretty good. So we made our presentations. Now I have to insert here one very important point. As we were moving along, Vern Schatz, who's a very bright guy, was criticizing our lack of, how would I say it, sophisticated ability to evaluate alternative code systems. And quite frankly, he was right. I mean, I wouldn't say we're winging it, but we were doing the best we could with what we had. And he said, you guys you're creating something that's going to be obsolete in not too distant future, and I think you're dead wrong. I'll come back to that point. We made in that second quarter, where was I? I was in the first quarter of '71. We felt that it was necessary to figure out whether or not the vast majority of companies, both retail as well as manufacturers, would go along with a decision that the ad hoc committee was basically trying to make before the all-important SMI convention in Dallas or Houston, Dallas in May of 1971. That was a target date. So I can tell you that I personally gave hundreds of presentations. Here was the deal. We would come to any organization and we would make a presentation on what was going on, the logic, the then fairly skinny model results, and we would ask only that the CEO then write a letter to Bert Gookin and the committee indicating their willingness to support whatever came of the decision of the ad hoc committee prior to the May meeting. The presentations that we made were had the following fundamental points. That given the net gain that we saw feasible from our early parametric model, this thing was unstoppable. The improvement in profitability of a retail organization was so profound that it was going to happen. And so you better first factor that into your thinking. We also made it abundantly clear that at that time we saw no particular advantage to the manufacturers from the productivity gains at the retail level. Later on I'll come back to that point, but we said, look, what you're gaining is the avoidance of multiple codes and multiple symbology, and so we think it's in your best interest. And number three, we committed to an ultimate solution that would minimize to the fullest extent possible the cost of container marked or the manufacturer marked symbols. And I can say that of those hundreds of presentations, which by the way were made to the leading manufacturer in each category, detergent category, beverage category, so forth, there was only one company that vigorously objected and said they were going to object at the meeting, and that was the General Electric company. And their position was that they had simply too many items, too many light bulbs, too many items, and they couldn't live with a 5-digit item number. So not wishing to, again, since we were lovers at the time, not fighters, we said, fine, we'll report back to the committee, and it'll be noted in the meeting that you disagree. And if you write a letter to that extent, we will publicize the letter. So about a month later, I called up the executive at Neela Park. I said, forget his name now. I said, I think his name was John. I said, John, I just want to give you a heads up. We've now met with virtually every major distributor, including, by the way, Sylvania, where Bert Gukin is on the board. And every other company in the United States has indicated in writing to the ad hoc committee that they would support. I just wanted you to know that you'll be the only one who will not be in support. About a week later, he called and said, Larry, we figured out a way, so you can cancel our objection. We're not going to object. Another interesting meeting I had with the Association of Beer Manufacturers. I forget the Brewers Association of America. And I went out to visit with them. There were 5 or 6 representatives, mostly very senior technical guys. We met at Anheuser-Busch headquarters in St. Louis, I believe. And when I arrived with my carousel of slides, they said, Larry, before you meet with us, we'd like you to go down on the production floor and show us where we're going to put the label applicator, because we have not figured out how to do that. Well, I said, fine. So I went down, and they showed me, at the time, their bottling lines, their washing lines were unbelievable, because they were reusing bottles, and I guess they still do. And so any label that might have been affixed to a container would have been terribly marred, if not destroyed, in the washing process. And then they took me to the bottling process, which was running at about 2,000 units per minute, I think. And you could barely see the bottles going by. And they said, well, where do you want us to insert the label applicator? And I said, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just a poor analyst from a little consulting company. So then I went up, and it was an adversarial meeting. I mean, they started battling me from about the 3rd slide in. So I shut down the projector. I took the carousel off the machine. I said, gentlemen, I'm not here to fight you. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to inform you what we're doing. And I don't particularly care what you choose to do, whether you choose to fight it or not fight it. I'm out of here. And they said, no, wait. We do want to know what you're doing. And so eventually, again, I'll come back to this later on, we found a solution that met their problems and also met the need for automation. Now, the meeting at the SMI meeting in May of '71 was a great success. It was an overwhelming success. There weren't any people there that were willing to stand up and be against the whole process. Partly because the process was viewed by most as objective, fair, analytical, and balanced. Fair and balanced, I guess, is the right word in today's world.